Hey, geeks and geekettes, it's Chuck Dixon back once again to answer questions, your questions sent in by you about what it is I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. So if you have a question for me, you can send it directly to brunobookstore@gmail.com. And I check it every day. And it's a good way to get your questions directly to me so I don't have to hunt for them across YouTube and Facebook and other places, although I do that too. All right, first question. Craig Romaine asks, if you could have a bit part in any movie, what would it be? It's funny. I don't think about this stuff very often, but I did actually think about this last week while watching one of my favorite TV shows, The Vikings. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be fun to be an extra on that show? And I can see it. I can see it because I'm almost 6'4", big guy, and I'm primarily of Irish and Scots-Irish um, ancestry, so I probably got some Viking blood in me somewhere way back when, and I can see it. I can see it. Can't you? That'd be a perfect fit for the Vikings, I think. Chuck Johnson, he wants to know, when you were writing the Batman character, was there an effort on your part or editorials to differentiate the two main Bat books? Or were they essentially treated as the same book with different titles? Well, actually, when I was on Detective, there were three regular Batman monthlies: Batman, Detective Comics, and Shadow of the Bat. Shadow of the Bat was actually created, the book was created at the first Bat Summit I went to. And it was created to be a book for Alan Grant, his very own monthly. And I remember long discussions over what to call the book. You know, we definitely wanted the word bat in there. So Denny O'Neil's first proposal was Annals of the Bat. And that got a laugh out of the whole group. And then he realized that he had never actually said the title out loud. So, Annals of the Bat. Scott Peterson, in particular, had a lot of fun with variations of that title. So, anyway, um, we were never directed to make any differentiation between the titles. There was kind of an understanding that Batman was the Batman title was the classic Batman stories, with theme villains and weirdness, and of course Doug Mensch filled the bill there. He certainly knew how to construct a classic Batman story. Um, Myself on Detective, I wanted to do detective stories. I wanted to concentrate on Batman's relationship with the police, do a lot of procedural type mysteries. I'd also introduce theme villains, but usually my theme villains were connected to the mystery involved. Characters like the Actuary um, were, and Gearhead were pretty much part of the mystery. Who is this character? Why is he doing what he's doing? So that's the direction that I took the book. I took it back to its classic roots because so many times, particularly in the modern era or postmodern era of Batman, there are very seldom any mystery stories. And I wanted to concentrate on that aspect of the book. Again, without any directive from Denny O'Neil or the other editors. I think Denny knew that we would just instinctively fill the needs that each of these books had. And then Shadow of the Bat was, Alan Grant had been on the Batman titles for quite a while and doing just amazing work on the titles. And his understanding of the Batman universe was, unparalleled. And Shadow of the Bat was a way that he could basically explore Alan Grant type themes, conspiracy themes, and things like that. I mean, Alan's mind is unique in the way he approaches storytelling And I suppose, he draws from his own background for some of the crazy stuff that he does. But Shadow of the Bat was a slightly darker, just a slightly darker, not Vertigo dark, or not, um, trying to be, I hate the word gritty, but Alan had a more twisted view of Gotham, and he explores this in Shadow of the Bat. And all three books, because we played nice together, they all complemented one another. We didn't contradict each other. This was the same Batman in each title. There was no, and it was obviously, if you read the titles together, it was the same universe. Now I remember at about, it was, we were finishing up Nightfall and finishing up Night's End. We had this big summit, a lot of people there, and Denny proposed to us that we would begin doing story arcs, 3-part story arcs that would all run in 1 month. And so each month would be written by one writer. So 1 month, Doug would write all 3 titles, Batman, Detective, and Shadow of the Bat, and tell one complete story. The next month, I would take over the 3 titles. The next month, Alan would take over the 3 titles. This way, we were writing the same number of issues each year, but not the same book. Now, Doug and Alan didn't say anything, but I sensed they weren't happy about this. I really wasn't happy about it because I was on Detective with my buddy Graham, and I thought we were on a creative roll. I thought we were, kicking ass. And I didn't want to stop doing that. And also, as a fan, I used to hate stories that began with one artist, continued with another, and concluded with a third. And we had very different art styles on all 3 books. I mean, there's, uh, the difference between Kelly Jones and Graham Nolan is, huge. Their approach to comics is entirely different. Both worthy, both wonderful, both perfect for Batman, but entirely different approaches. And I thought it'd be really jarring for the readers. And also creatively for me, I just wanted to work with Graham. And I definitely sensed that Doug did not want anybody else working with Kelly but himself. And that was fine. They were perfectly suited for each other. So I complained. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I do not want to do that. There's a million reasons that this just won't work for me, and I don't think it'll work for the readers. And then he explained to me, he says, you understand that Batman sells a lot better than Detective. It always has, historically. You go back to the 50s and the 60s, Batman always outsells Detective by a considerable amount. He said, if you were writing Batman, 4 times a year, essentially, your royalties would increase dramatically. And I said, I still don't want to do it. I don't care about that. When I'm sitting writing at home, I'm not thinking about the royalties. And I think Doug's, there was a sigh of relief from Doug because he would have to give up royalties to another writer, being off Batman. And I had no interest in taking royalties away from Doug or anyone else. And so obviously Denny had already discussed this with, I believe at this point, Paul Levitz was our editor-in-chief. He had already discussed because he immediately had to get on the phone with the home office. He had to call back to DC Comics and say, Chuck doesn't want to do this. And Denny being Denny, he didn't think about socially awkward situations or other people's feelings. He held his phone call in the next room, and we all sat there listening to it. We could hear every word he said. And I remember him saying, yeah, I can't believe it either. I've never heard of a writer refusing more royalties. But in any case, if you read the Batman books in that period, you know that Denny's idea never happened. So there you go, some inside baseball. I've never told that story before, and it's probably your first time hearing it. And I know I like hearing stories about behind the scenes like that. So I hope you enjoyed that. Next question, Kirk Ferguson. Who are your favorite Western actors? Doesn't have to be stars. For instance, 2 of mine are Warren Oates and L.Q. Jones. Oh boy, my favorite Western actors. Warren Oates, for those who don't know, is one of those actors that you see him, you might not remember his name, but he was in westerns. He was in Stripes with Bill Murray playing Sergeant Hulka. Just a colorful guy, terrific actor, but great character actor. Tremendous commitment on his part to every role. And he got to be the lead in quite a few movies in the 70s, and always did an amazing job. He was kind of a hillbilly Bogart. Oh, there's never been another actor quite like him. L.Q. Jones was a terrific Western character actor. I believe he's still with us. And his authentic Texas accent always helped. Always played a laconic sidekick or vile killer. Um, and he's a guy. He's a guy I always enjoyed seeing in movies. And I can't think of. Remember seeing him in a couple of war movies, but primarily he was in westerns. And even when he was in modern day uh, settings, he still played a western type character. Uh, just typecast, and I think he was happy to be so because he was very, very busy throughout his career. Of the big Western stars, I mean, obviously you've got Clint Eastwood and John Wayne, and I enjoyed them, but I always liked Randolph Scott. Randolph Scott was maybe the most prolific Western actor for A pictures and quality B pictures. He just made a string of Westerns from the 40s through the 50s, came out of retirement to make Ride the High Country, and that was his last film. Um, and many of his Westerns in the 50s he produced himself. He became a very, very wealthy man making, you know, B Western programmers for the bottom part of a double feature. And excellent westerns. The guy had a real taste for hiring directors and writers, and he put together these tight little productions that cost very little to make, but were always profitable. Very, very successful all around the world. Randolph Scott is mostly forgotten today. Uh, Probably most people know him from the line in Blazing Saddles, "You do it for Randolph Scott." Uh, and this is Randolph Scott, one of my favorites. Audie Murphy's another one, a war hero who you know basically parlayed his fame into a movie career. He's the most decorated American soldier in our history. Um, and despite his war wounds and the psychological scars of warfare, he turned himself into quite an actor. He mostly made westerns. I think he liked westerns. Again, another guy with a natural Texas drawl, but he had a physicality. He could ride. He could obviously shoot, and he was very convincing in his roles. I particularly like it when he played bad guys because there was a darkness in him that he would allow out when he was playing someone villainous. But he got to work with a lot of top Western directors of the 50s. He got to work with John Huston and Anthony Mann, and I always thought he did a great job. A lot of commitment on, and you know he never phoned it in, and he made a lot of westerns. Very prolific through the 50s. Glenn Ford's another one. Glenn Ford, another guy is a war hero. He worked with every single top director making westerns, and the thing about Ford that I enjoyed, much like Jimmy Stewart, is he had a great range. He could play the tough guy, but he was also adept at comedy, and he made a number of comedy westerns, The Rounders and The Sheepman, and he was always very funny. But in the tough guy roles, there was no one tougher. And I also liked when he played a villain. 310 to Yuma is one of his greatest roles, and he is just a rotten guy in that movie. He is Satan personified, persuasive and cool and charming and deadly. But terrific actor. Burt Lancaster was very fond of westerns and made a number of terrific ones all the way through his career, even into his you know at the twilight of his career when he made a string of westerns in the 70s. Some of my favorites: Lawman, Valdez is Coming, Alzana's Raid. Here he is in The Professionals, a movie which if you haven't seen, you must see. He teams up with Lee Marvin, Woody Strode, and Robert Ryan for a mission into Mexico to rescue Claudia Cardinale from Mexican bandit leader Jack Palance. I mean, just from that description, you want to see it. I mean, hell, from that description, I want to watch it again. So, Lancaster liked Westerns. His natural physicality lent itself to that genre. Scalp Hunters is another one. He plays this terrific, cynical Bostonian character. He allowed his accent to come through in that one. His northeastern accent to come through. But Kirk Douglas is another one. Obviously enjoyed making westerns. Another guy whose physicality lent itself to the genre. And if he only ever made one western, he'd be one of my favorites. It's a movie called Man Without a Star, and it's just a terrific, terrific, everything but the kitchen sink range war western. Kirk even sings and plays the banjo in it, and it works. And he plays another charming rogue character who has a dark streak, and one of my favorites. James Coburn is a guy who moved from character actor into lead roles. He worked quite a bit with Sam Peckinpah, but he had lead western roles in movies like Waterhole Number 3 and Duck You Sucker, and made a number of Italian westerns. But he was always like just a natural fit. Another one of those laconic, lanky characters who looked very much at home in a western, and to some degree looked very period. He looked like he belonged in that era. Barbara Stanwyck was every bit the equal of any other Western star. She could ride and shoot and do all the things that you had to do in a Western excellently and totally believably and with authenticity. And she made a number of really, really solid Westerns throughout her career. Cattle Queen of Montana, The Furies, 40 Guns, and lots of others. And of course, she was the lead in her own Empire Western TV series, Big Valley. But Babs could do it all, and was an equal to the men as far as toughness. The Violent Men is another one. Excellent movie with it's like a Western noir with Glenn Ford and Edward G. Robinson. And she is the femme fatale, and she's terrific in that movie as well. Bruce Dern is a personal favorite of mine. I used to love it when he would show up on TV shows and then finally in movies. He made a number of westerns. Sometimes was the lead in films like Posse with Kirk Douglas, and probably most memorable for being the only person to kill John Wayne on screen in the movie The Cowboys. Sorry if I'm spoiling that for you. Another absolute favorite of mine is Slim Pickens. Slim Pickens, a former rodeo clown who moved into making movies and basically always played himself. But he played himself with such tremendous conviction that he was always a marvel to watch. There was, it always seemed, he's one of those actors who wasn't really acting. He was just reacting to the role he was in, but he was always effective and always believable and always fully authentic in tons and tons of Western roles as the comedy relief sidekick, or in Pat Garrett, the Millionth Kid, in scenes that would one of the few Western scenes. It's a total tearjerker, and of course the amazing, unforgettable conclusion of Dr. Strangelove. In which he was cast as a B-52 bomber pilot and was not told that it was a comedy, which works perfectly. He plays it absolutely straight, as only Slim Pickens could. So there you go. That's just the start. I could go on and on. I could do an hour-long segment of this just about my favorite Western stars and actors. I've left out so many, but maybe another time. Scott Heilman. Hey, Scott. Chuck, of all the TV series you've enjoyed, although this might apply to book series, movie series, etc., has there ever been something that to you is so obvious of a potential story the original writers or creators somehow completely overlooked? Maybe offhanded comment between characters or something. I'm hoping I'm saying this clearly. Yes, you are. And this comes up a lot. I may revisit this question from time to time as I remember examples. But two examples leap out at me of places where things went wrong or missed opportunities. And I'm going to do a things go wrong, and then I'm going to do a missed opportunity. Okay, The Walking Dead. We all know The Walking Dead. The premise is simple. The dead arise and begin eating people, and society collapses. Okay, fantastic. Well, in season 2 of Walking Dead, Shane dies, and he's killed. And that, to me, was an enormous mistake on the part of the show. It's Rick who should have died. Looking back over all these seasons, Shane should have lived. John Bernthal should have been the star of this show. Because when you watch the first 2 seasons, you're introduced to Shane, and you're supposed to think that he's a prick. But as the show goes on, you realize that everything Shane has done has been the right move. Everything he says is advice that should be followed. And we're supposed to believe he's a prick because he's fooling around with Rick's wife. Well, they both thought Rick was dead, so come on, grow up. But everything Shane says is right. The show should have been called Listen to Shane. Uh, and when he dies, everything goes to hell for these people. And they realize, and this isn't in the script or anything else, but it's obvious that the cast of characters realize that after Shane is dead, that Shane's way of looking at the world, his ruthless, take no prisoners view of how to survive in this apocalypse, were all dead on, and they begin to adopt his methods. The only thing about his death that I like is his death is a big FU to them, because when he dies, not from being bitten or eaten by zombies, but just from being shot, he returns as a zombie. And then they realize that everyone who dies will return as a zombie. So it's like, wow, Shane is even telling us from the grave things we need to know now. So that takes me to missed opportunity. Okay, The Dirty Dozen. The Dirty Dozen is one of my favorite movies. I watch it maybe at least twice a year, and I've done that since its release. I can't remember how many times I saw it at the theater and how many times I watched it on, television. And I've owned it on, Betamax, VHS, Laserdisc, DVD, and Blu-ray. Whatever format they move on to next, I'll probably own it in that too. I have this one sheet poster hanging on the wall of my office. I can look at it every day. So I do love this movie. But there's a missed opportunity in this movie, in the third act. Now, if you've never seen the movie, Lee Marvin is Major Reisling, tough guy, Army Ranger, and he is assigned to train 12 hardened criminals facing the gallows. These guys are all going to be hung for murder or rape or whatever. Just horrible, nasty guys. 12 terrific character actors assembled that he has to train for a secret mission behind German lines. And there's hijinks in the training and complications and all this stuff leading up to it. It's a marvelously written story because it just doesn't go from point A to point B. It doesn't keep reminding you of its plot. It deals in pretty much in vignettes leading up to the mission. So the whole movie isn't about the mission. The whole movie is about this group bonding and training and preparing for the mission. And the mission is to, prior to D-Day, like the days before D-Day, is to go to this chateau in France that's full of partying Nazis and kill all of them, by whatever means. And of course, everything goes wrong on the mission. There's lots of suspenseful moments, and ultimately they succeed in cutting off communications for this chateau and killing everybody in a classic deconstructed plotline. And the major part of the deconstructionist plotline is Telly Savalas. Telly Savalas plays Maggot, and of the Dirty Dozen, he is the dirtiest. He's some sort of religious psycho nut. This guy's completely batshit crazy. And he's a danger to the mission, and Major Reisling, Lee Marvin, knows this. He knows this from the start. Maggot is going to be trouble when they get on the ground. But the problem is, his orders from his superior officers is Maggot, everybody has to go along. If one of the Dirty Dozen fails in training or tries to escape or makes too much trouble, they all go back to the gallows. And all of the dozen know this. Lee Marvin has shared this information with them. If one of you screws up, you all get the chop. So they've got to take Maggot along. So what's Major Risling to do? Well, they've established this guy as ruthless. They've established this guy as anything for the mission, anything to get it done. And to my mind, why wouldn't he have a plan for dealing with Maggot? Because Maggot is he gives him a role in the mission that's key. Now, why would you give that to an unpredictable psycho? It never made sense to me. And remember, I love this movie, but I think this is something they didn't think hard enough about. Were I to rewrite the third act of Dirty Dozen, I would have Risling ask Clint Walker and Jim Brown, the biggest, most daunting, most dangerous members of the Dirty Dozen, to take care of Telly Savalas once they got on the ground. Once they land in France, kill Maggot. Find him, kill him. Because we can't have him as part of the mission. But we can't go on the mission without him. So we're forced into a situation where we've got to take out our weakest man. In my version, they would try to kill Maggot, and Maggot would escape. This makes Maggot even more of a wild card than he was before, because he escapes into the woods in France, in Normandy, and we don't know where he is or when he's going to reappear. Now, as suspenseful as the end of the Dirty Dozen is, this would crank the suspense to 11, so that when Maggot does show up, everything goes to hell even faster. It's a even more deconstructed storyline with Maggot on the loose and pissed because they tried to kill him. Now he's got a reason to freak out on all of them. And I think that would make Dirty Dozen a great movie, even greater. But of course, that's never going to happen unless they invent a time machine and I can somehow go back and talk to Robert Aldrich, talk him into this ending. Next question, Matthew Pack. Is there a particular genre, comic book, you'd like to take a crack at, such as humor, romance, biography, etc.? Yeah, I've always wanted to write a romance comic, just for the challenge of writing a romance comic. Once upon a time, romance comics were the backbone of the comic book industry. Through the 50s and into the early 60s, romance comics were the biggest sellers. So some things like young romance sold into millions of copies a month. At its peak, it was selling 3 million copies a month. So it was a very popular genre. You had a lot of female readers. And the best of these comics, the best romance comics, because every publisher published romance comics, the best ones were from a publisher called St. John's. And St. John's approach to the romance comics was different because they had a writer named Dana Dutch, a man of mystery. He had been an executive editor at Ace Books, editing paperback novels, and he wrote without credit hundreds and hundreds of romance stories. He wasn't the only writer, but he set the template for St. John's romance stories. And what was different about their romance stories was that the women were more independently minded. There were more surprises in the stories because the women were making decisions. They weren't being driven by events. The typical story was, how do I get him to fall for me? Or which of the men who are after me am I going to choose? Am I going to go with the bad boy or go with the good guy or the rich guy? These stories had a template. Well, Dutch would turn this template on its head, and he wrote very mature stories that were very interesting, very engaging, and mostly they didn't take place in fantasy worlds. They dealt with the real issues of human relationships, falling in love with the wrong person, and the consequences of that. And they also dealt very real world. His characters were truck drivers and waiters and waitresses and pharmacists and things like that. They lived in small towns, and there was a sense, there was a life. They had family and everything else. And in these stories, which generally ran about 8 pages, you were introduced to a whole cast of new characters each time. And the setups were always engaging. He always quickly got you into the story. And the most remarkable thing is the decisions the women would make would often come as a surprise. Which guy they would pick, or they would purposely dump a guy, who had wronged them in some way and never look back. You know, uh, some of them almost, I think, served. I don't know if this was his intention, as cautionary tales for women about what kind of guy to look out for, or the qualities that you wanted to have in a soulmate, or whatever like that. But there was just a more mature approach, because quite frankly, the vast majority of romance comics in that period were dopey, and kind of pandering. They were all Cinderella stories, princess stories, and not much to them. But Dana Dutch, he had the goods. He had the goods. Now, as far as me writing romance, I did get to write one, but it never got produced. At CrossGen, we were going to do a gothic western, a gothic romance series called Raven House. And initially, it was going to be drawn by Mike Pickens, and then he moved on to something else, and then we were going to have Leonardo Manco draw the series. But it was set, in the 1800s Jane Austen period, and very much sort of a cross between Jane Austen and Henry Fielding kind of story. And so yeah, we never got around to it. But I'll tell you what, I wrote the script for the first one, 32-page issue. And if you email me at Bruno Bookstore at gmail.com, I'll send you a Word file of the script for the first issue, so you can read it yourself. Okay, what was the reaction of your editors when you had the King and the Dragon show up as bodyguards in Green Arrow? Did they have to make special arrangements with or pay fees to the respective estates for use of their likenesses, or since they weren't specifically named, did that give you a pass? Well, yeah, there's a 2-issue arc of Green Arrow where an obvious Elvis Presley and an obvious Bruce Lee show up as bodyguards to a rich Near Eastern potentate. And basically, the idea began when I was working at Eclipse, and I noticed that Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe would appear frequently on covers of Eclipse comics, that they would always contrive a reason to have Elvis or Marilyn on a cover. And I asked Dean Mullaney about it once. I said, what are you, like, big fans? And he says, no, not particularly. I just discovered that whenever we stick Elvis or Marilyn on a cover, sales go up, because there are Elvis and Marilyn devotees who will buy anything with their image on it. So he could count on, another few thousand copies being sold if he stuck them on the cover. And that kind of stuck in my mind. And I even at Eclipse proposed a series that, if we could work it out with the Elvis estate, that we would do it. I want to do a series of comics with Elvis as a private eye in Las Vegas in the 1960s. And I thought that would be a kick. I even had an artist in Argentina who would have been absolutely perfect for the series. He had a style that looked very retro 60s, and it would have been cool, but we never got off the ground with it. I think Dean made inquiries to the Elvis estate, and they simply weren't interested. But getting to Green Arrow, in the Green Arrow story, Connor Hawke wins a mixed martial arts competition handily, and it turns out this competition was a tryout to be bodyguard for a young, Saudi prince who needed bodyguards against other members of his family who were looking to depose him. It was oh boy, I can't remember the name of the country. It was a fictional Arab country in the DC universe. It had already been established, but I set quite a few stories there, and I had this prince back a number of times in Green Arrow and Robin. But anyway, he gets hired, and there's already 2 bodyguards there, and it's Elvis and Bruce Lee. And these are the issues that they appear in. Artwork by Rodolfo DiMaggio. So you've got Elvis Presley and Bruce Lee never named. They are referred to as the King and the Dragon, and it's obviously them, a little older, little grayer, and but there's lots of sly references to who they actually are in case readers missed it. And um, DC's reaction to all of this was my editors basically freaked out. They didn't like the idea because I wanted Elvis and Bruce Lee on the cover. I thought, hey, that'll move another 20,000 copies to Bruce Lee and Elvis fans. But legal at DC said no freaking way, and they said be very careful never to name them, and never make it obvious that, or never even imply that they are the real Elvis and real Bruce Lee. So I had to play it like they were lookalikes, but there were enough references in the story that readers and Connor Hawke understood these are the real guys. Their deaths were faked, and they basically retired to look after this Saudi prince. So there you go. One of the wackier stories it did for Green Arrow, but I thought it worked well. And of course, the Rodolfo DiMaggio artwork puts it right over the top. All right, here's another hot question along the lines of the character, actor, Western, whatever question. David Finn asks, what is your favorite 1970s crime movie? For me, the 70s is the golden age of the crime movie. The rating system allowed for more gore, sex, and bad language, darker themes, and the filmmaking style of the period was all about hyperrealism. And that just lent itself to a string of terrific crime films and all the different crime subgenres. So I'm going to list a few leading up to my absolute favorite. The Onion Field. It's based on the Joseph Wambaugh recount of the true story of a pair of, lowlifes who kidnap two L.A. police officers, uh, leading to the murder of one of them in an onion field uh, outside of the city. The movie is absolutely harrowing. It's the first time I ever saw James Woods in a role. He's absolutely unforgettable, and it's a harrowing and frustrating movie to watch. Not as frustrating as the book. The book is a page turner, but it's an enraging book. This was the longest court trial in the history of California. It's extremely frustrating as politics and criminal prosecution get mixed in an unholy brew that delays justice entirely for these two police officers. It's also a case that changed all the procedures in the Los Angeles Police Department for years to come. But excellent movie, excellent crime film, excellent, almost documentary style story of those true events. Blue Collar is another one, a screenplay by Paul Schrader. Yaphet Kotto, Richard Pryor, and Harvey Keitel are automobile workers in Detroit who decide to rob their own union. It's part comedy, it's part tragedy. It has all the elements of a crime story, although it isn't strictly a crime story, but it is. It's a crime movie, but it isn't. And some amazing, amazing dialogue. I saw this when I was a blue collar worker, and this movie really, really spoke to me. There's a lot of stuff about, there's a lot of very, very mature contemplation about race, about class, and a lot of other things. And it's quite an amazing movie, and all three principals give stellar performances. Pryor, particularly, shows that, man, that guy could act. He really was the whole package. And he's funny and terribly effective in his role as a guy who's just trying to keep his head above water. Um, Next one up is, and it's Yaphet Kotto again, Across 110th Street. This was an A picture made to cash in on the black exploitation um, craze or fad or cycle that was growing in the early 70s. And that's the only black exploitation or movie that could be considered a black exploitation movie that I ever saw at a suburban theater. Usually I'd have to go downtown to see these movies and go into Philly to see these movies. But this one actually played in our local Eric cinema. But it's a terrific film about uh, a gang that robs a mafia counting room and then tries to escape from Harlem. And Yaphet Kotto is the by the books young Turk investigator, Anthony Quinn as the old school corrupt cop, and it's a fantastic thriller. It's a terrific picture of New York City at the time. Very enjoyable police procedural movie. The Burglars. Jean-Paul Belmondo plays a guy who shows up in Greece for a gem heist, and he's thwarted by venal, corrupt cop Omar Sharif, who wants a part of the take. Can Belmondo steal the gems and get out of Greece without having to cut into his share? Typical Belmondo film. It's got lots of tremendous stunts done by Belmondo himself, and a really a fun car chase that goes into subways and everything else. A Reme Julien car chase, but it's not a very well known film. It's called La Casa in France. It was released here as The Burglars, and it's one of my favorites from this period, and one of the few French crime films that I got to see in a theater, because we didn't get a lot of their movies over here, but I've since caught up. Friends of Eddie Coyle. It's based on a George V. Higgins novel. Higgins was a prosecuting attorney in Boston, and he wrote novels based on his hours and hours and hours of listening to mafia wiretaps, which informs all of his dialogue. Robert Mitchum, in what I consider to be his last great performance, is Eddie Coyle, whose friends aren't anything but. And he's kind of a stooge, a goon, and he's kind of set up as bagman for a bunch of vile, vicious bank robbers. Uh, it's it's um, it's a real '70s crime film. It's shot in sort of gritty, grainy way that films of that period often were. It pulls no punches. There's no romance about crime in this movie, and the suspense is incredible as uh, Mitchum's world changes around him, and he's simply not realizing it. Okay, Dillinger. Warren Oates perfectly cast as John Dillinger in a film written and directed by John Milius. The period is presented in a believable way. This for 1930s gangster film, bank robbing movie. This one for me is far superior to Bonnie and Clyde. the the whole cast: Ben Johnson as Melvin Purvis. You've got Harry Dean Stanton. Uh, you know, Richard Dreyfuss as Babyface Nelson. I mean, just a terrific movie, terrific period film, and lots and lots and lots of action. There are lots of bank robberies and gunfights with BARs and Thompsons and 45s. It is just one hell of a ride. And with Milius on board, you know it's going to be the real goods. All right, Who'll Stop the Rain? Um, Nick Nolte as a Vietnam vet, now merchant marine, who helps a buddy out, his buddy John Savage out, by helping him smuggle a package of heroin into the United States to help out John Savage's wife, played by Tuesday Weld. Um, Nick Nolte as Ray Hicks is a revelation. For me, it's his first great film role. First time he gets to play a three-dimensional, fully realized character. And it's a heck of a crime film. And the most remarkable thing about it is it leans into the banality of evil. It's kind of a cliche, but Anthony Zerba and a number of other character actors as the bad guys are simply terrific in the casual way they go about doing the evil that they do. And it's got a great climax out in the California desert. A different way of looking at shootouts it was just a different kind of action crime film, sort of grown up, sort of more mature than the genre had been up to this period. And again, an amazing performance by Nick Nolte. The Great Train Robbery, based on the Michael Crichton novel and directed by Michael Crichton. This is a train robbery set during the Victorian period with Michael Caine or not Michael Caine, Sean Connery. Michael Caine could have been in it. Sean Connery and Donald Sutherland, and a great cast of British actors. It's funny, it's sometimes grim, and the ending is extremely suspenseful. Terrific heist film. Speaking of heist films, The Hot Rock. It's a comedy heist film based on the Donald Westlake novel with a William Goldman screenplay, and it's a great buddy film, but it's also a very funny and often very suspenseful heist movie, as this gang has to steal the same gem over and over and over again. They steal it, then they lose it, then they have to steal it back. It's perfectly cast. I've read all of these novels. I think Westlake wrote, 15 or 16 novels featuring John Dortmunder and his gang. And the biggest delight for me was Rob Liebman as Stan Murch, the getaway driver, because he's one of my favorite characters in fiction. And Liebman plays him perfectly, plays him to absolute perfection. And Robert Redford is surprisingly effective in a comedy role as John Dortmunder. I wouldn't have cast him as John Dortmunder, but he does an amazing job of investing himself in the character. And it's beautifully paced. It's a very funny movie. Even today, a comedy all works. And it's one of those movies of, I imagine that the people that made the Ocean's 11 remake were fans of this movie because they kind of adopted the cool factor and the the chemistry. The chemistry in this cast is very much like the one in the Ocean's 11 remake. Okay, we're getting to the top of the heap here. French Connection, 1971, made Gene Hackman a superstar, Best Picture of the Year. And what it did primarily was bring the French style of crime filmmaking to the United States. It's a French Connection in more ways than one. The style was very much like Jean-Claude Melville and other French film directors, where it's a slow, laconic, slow burn, deliberately paced police procedural story, where we're basically in the car with these guys. We're right in their faces. We're right in with the group of men, and the acting is very naturalistic. It's shot in a very what it was shot on a very low budget. But William Friedkin, the director, took advantage of that to give the film a verisimilitude. Lots of handheld camera work. And of course, one of the most memorable car chases of all, shot on the streets of New York early on a Sunday morning without permits. It's just put Gene Hackman behind the wheel and just drive like a bat out of hell. And the accident you see in the car chase actually happened. That's a real accident. They had to give that guy some cash to keep him from complaining. Okay, now we're getting to my number one. Taking a Pelham 123 is my number one favorite crime film of the 70s. It's about a gang of desperate criminals who hijack a New York subway car deep in tunnels beneath the city and basically hold the city hostage until they are paid $1 million in ransom. Walter Matthau, in one of the first of what would be a tremendous string of dramatic roles in crime films, he plays the traffic cop, the New York Police Traffic Division's detective, who is the primary negotiator with Robert Shaw and his gang of criminals. Directed by TV director Joseph Sargent, mostly known for his TV work. It's a tremendous portrait of pre-Giuliani New York, 70s New York, and with its attitudes and the look of it and everything else. It's also an absolutely seamless thriller. We see lots of hostage thrillers like this, but nothing comes close to taking of Pelham 123. And one of the best things about it is uh, there's a grim, cynical sense of humor about it, a New Yorker's sense of humor, especially a 1970 New Yorker's sense of humor, the city that was told to drop dead but wouldn't die. And Yeah, for me. This is the cream of the crop. This is the best one, and this is a movie that I can watch anytime. I think I watch this like 3 times a year, and I learn something new each time. For pacing, acting, atmosphere, it can't be beat. So there you go. That's it for this week. But if you would, could you please hit the like button? Doesn't cost you anything. Little thumbs up, little attaboy for Ask Chuck Dixon. And it sure helps a lot because it helps. The likes help spread the word about this little segment I do once a week, and it's very much appreciated if you would help spread that word. Thanks so much, and I'll see you down the road.